Hey guys, I wanted to talk to you today a little bit about turntables. As you may know, there's a little bit of a vinyl revival going on right now. The format's making kind of a comeback after about 20 years of obsolescence, I guess you could say. It was superseded by CD. CD then was superseded by various digital formats. But recently, a lot of people have discovered the sort of physical qualities of vinyl. Of course, you get the nice big jackets. It's a tactile feel when you put on a record to listen to it, when you physically lift the tone arm. It's just a different experience listening to a record than it is listening to a digital file or even a CD. So a lot of people getting into the format for the first time, a lot of people like myself getting back into it after many years, and probably have questions about what to look for in a turntable. You don't know where to even start, how to go about buying one, so I'm going to hopefully answer some of those questions for you today. Now you may wonder what qualifications I have to tell you what kind of turntable to buy. Well, back in the 80s and 90s, I actually was an electronic salesman. I sold turntables for a living. I sold many different models. I got to use many different models. And while I don't pretend that electronic salesmen are always the world's greatest experts on electronics, what I do know is what my customers used to ask me for. So I can help you understand the kinds of features that people in those days wanted. And I think that can be helpful because understand that at that point turntables had been on the market for many years. So people coming into my store asking me for certain features, that was probably their third, fourth, even fifth turntable that they'd bought, so they knew what to look for. Now, first things first, this is not a video about money is no object turntables. I'm going to try to keep the price range for you down under $500 and hopefully a lot less than that. This turntable that I have right here, this is a Sony PSLX3. I'm actually going to have a video specifically about this later. This turntable cost me $74 and it's a great turntable. It holds up with any of the modern turntables out there. That said, there are quite a few new turntables you can get for under $500 or even under $200. Now first, what are some general things to look for in any turntable, whether new or used? Well, one thing to look for is just the total mass of the turntable. This weighs about 15 pounds and it's on nice sturdy vibration damping feet. All of that helps to dampen vibration in the turntable itself, which improves the sound. Now I've removed the dust cover here just to give you a little better look. Most of the mass of a turntable is obviously going to be in the base or the plinth, but you do want the platter to have a little bit of its own mass. I'm just going to take the mat off here. This is a rubber mat. These come in different materials. One is not necessarily better than the others, so don't really let that sway you. It's really just down to personal preference. This platter on this turntable is, I believe, aluminum, but it still has some heft to it. You can kind of probably guess by looking at it. This, I would say, weighs maybe a pound, maybe a little more, and that will help to dampen vibrations as well. So that's another thing to look for in a turntable. The tone arm, of course, is very important. There's a whole science behind tone arms. You don't really need to go too deeply into it. But one thing that I will say is low mass is generally better. That's why turntables like the Project Debut Carbon use carbon fiber these days. Sony had their own design. This is an ultra low mass tone arm from Sony. It's very thin. And the reason you want low mass is because even though there's a counterweight on a decent turntable that will balance the stylus in front, what happens with a high mass tone arm is that it's constantly being pulled towards the center of the record by the grooves, and that inertia can cause problems in the sound and also skating problems, stability problems basically. Your records just won't track as well with a high mass tone arm. So that's another thing to look for. Now there are two turntable drive types, belt drive and direct drive. This is a direct drive turntable. Many turntables are also belt drive. One is not necessarily better than the other. It really just depends on the philosophy behind a specific turntable. In the very old days, direct drive turntables were considered slightly inferior because the motor was directly underneath the record, which could theoretically transfer some noise to the stylus, and tests on those older turntables did sometimes show that. This is a later model turntable. Any turntable from the 70s onwards, I would say, if it's direct drive, it's not going to transfer any noise, so don't worry about it. One nice thing about direct drive is that you never need to change the belt, which on a belt drive turntable, especially a used one, is often a concern. Changing a belt on a turntable is not a big deal. You just have to take the platter off like this, and the belt will usually be strung around here and then go to a spindle somewhere. It can be a little tricky getting it back on, but it's usually not a big deal. What can be harder, especially on a used turntable, is actually finding the right belt. So that's one consideration, and it's one reason why I actually went with direct drive. But on a new turntable, it's much less of a concern. Now, different turntables have different methods for maintaining speed, and this is very important. And you might see in the specs that I provide later for some of the turntables that a few of them can be plus or minus a few percentage points in their speed stabilization. You might see some turntables around the platter have a set of dots. That's one method of calibrating the speed. That usually means it has to be done manually by you. And the way you do that is there's a little light that shines, and as it's running, you calibrate the speed until the dot looks like it's not moving. Later turntables had more automatic methods of calibrating the speed, and that's why you don't see those dots around this platter. My turntable, you see right here, maybe you can't, it says servo lock. That uses a series of magnets in the platter itself that it measures the speed of, and it can tell and it can control internally how fast the platter is spinning. Other turntables were quartz locked. The PS-LX5, which is the model just above this one, was quartz locked. You might see any of those methods still on the market today. Let me just show you how that works on this particular turntable. Power's on, I just hit the start stop, and it's locked. That little light comes on, tells me that the speed is now locked. And as you could probably tell, this is a fully automatic turntable. I press a button, the tone arm moves over, lowers down onto the record, and it plays. It gets to the end, it returns back. I don't ever really need to touch the tone arm if I don't want to. Automatic turntables have sort of fallen out of favor a bit these days. I think the reason for that is that in the 70s and 80s they were considered less reliable. There's more of a mechanism inside. They're less simple than mechanical turntables, which means there's more to break. I don't know that that ever was proven to be a problem. This turntable for sure, and I know from their reputation, it works fine. It's 35 years old and has no problem at all, and I haven't really heard of too many more problems with automatic turntables than with manual ones. So I think just like in the old days, if you want an automatic turntable, you're probably not going to get one in the low end, but it's not something to be afraid of, certainly. And it can make, especially if you're used to listening to CDs or digital files, it can make listening to records a lot more convenient. Now, unless you're using an amplifier specifically with a phono input, you're probably going to need one of these. This is a phono preamplifier, and it's designed to allow modern amplifiers without phono inputs to interface with turntables. Turntables have very low-level signals, and a phono preamp will boost that signal just enough to match your other components. That way you can plug your turntable into pretty much any input you want, auxiliary, CD, whatever you want, it'll work. But if your amplifier doesn't have a phono input, you need one of these boxes. You can buy these on Amazon or various other sites around the net. Mine actually isn't the best. You can buy better ones than this. And actually, if you have a vintage amplifier, the phono preamps built into vintage amplifiers were better than most of the separate preamps that you can buy today. I actually have a vintage amplifier myself, but right now I have my turntable plugged into a monoprice hybrid tube amp, which is a modern amplifier that only takes a CD input. That's why I have this box. If you have a similar amplifier or receiver that was built after turntables sort of fell out of favor, then you're probably going to need a preamp as well. Now let's say you've decided to buy new overused. What are some of the models to look at? Well, first, avoid Crosley Cruisers or anything like it. You don't want one of these suitcase turntables. The reason is tracking force. They do not come with these counterweights. They don't have good tone arms. They don't have good cartridges. This right here, you want to have in the under 3 gram range when it's actually sitting on your record. You don't want any more than that, or it can actually dig into the grooves of your record and degrade the sound quality and eventually destroy them, and that can happen pretty quickly when you have a high tracking force. Crosley Cruisers and other turntables like that from Crosley, they generally have tracking force in the 5 to 6 gram range. That's not a good idea. Now, Crosley does have a couple of new turntables out there. They have a new line which may be better. There's not enough data out there to really say for sure, but I would at least wait until there are some more reviews of those out there. But in terms of models you should consider, first would be the U-Turn Orbit. This started out as a Kickstarter or Indiegogo project, one of the two. It was crowdfunded, but eventually turned into a real product, and it's now here. You can order it from their website. It's a nice no-frills turntable made in the USA up in Boston. You can customize it to your heart's content. They start at $179. The base model is very no frills. I don't think it even has a cueing lever. You can add that now. But you know, they have they're belt driven. The belt is on the outside of the turntable. If you want to change speeds, you have to physically move the belt from one spindle to the other. It's not a big deal, but again, it is fully manual. If you want to move up a little bit, similar to the U-Turn Orbit is actually the Project Essential 2. These have a really good reputation around the net as well. They are, again, very similar to the U-Turn Orbit. They are fully manual, belt-driven. Belt is on the outside. If you want to go up a little bit from there, we have the Project Debut Carbon, which has a low-mass carbon fiber tone arm. This one here is steel. The Debut Carbon is carbon fiber, which should give it a similar low mass quality. And the Debut Carbon also has the belt on the inside, which if you care about looks might look better to you, I don't know. TEAC also makes a pretty good turntable, the TEAC T300N. It comes in various different finishes. All of them are quite beautiful actually, which is not something you can really say about either the U-Turn Orbit or the Project Essential, which come with quite basic MDF plinths. The TEAC T300N, it's also MDF underneath, but it has a wood veneer or a very glossy, bright paint job, depending on the finish that you choose. Looks beautiful. Spec-wise, I don't think it quite measures up to some of the others, but it does look pretty, doesn't it? Next to consider is the Onkyo CP1050. This is a new model from Onkyo, although it's styled like it was made in the 60s or 70s. It's quite a beautiful turntable and quite heavy from what I've heard. It is quite large. It has sort of the floating look that you might have seen with wood sides, although they are MDF, and then a separate plinth inside that. It's actually, from what I've seen, really just one piece construction. It's not actually floating, it's just for looks. And I've seen sort of mixed reviews about the turntable as a whole. So definitely go into it with sort of a skeptical mind, but if you want to look up some reviews, check it out, the Onkyo CP1050. I've always liked Onkyo myself, but I know they're not quite what they used to be. And I have to admit, I almost forgot one of the most popular sort of low-end turntables out there, and that's the Audio-Technica ATLP120. This is labeled as a professional turntable, with professional there in air quotes, and that is code for it being a DJ turntable. It does have pitch control and other things that consumers generally don't need. Meanwhile, it has a plastic plinth. It has a signal-to-noise ratio of about 50. So it's really actually not as good as some of these other options for really critical listening. But if you like the look, and especially if you want to do USB connectivity so that you can convert some of your records into MP3s, it's not a bad option. And the last one that I'll mention is the Denon DP300F. Now this turntable I actually really like. Spec-wise, it's maybe similar to the TIAC in some ways. It doesn't have the greatest specifications, but it is a fully automatic turntable, which none of these other new options are. It's the only automatic turntable in this group. And again, I like automatic turntables. It also comes in silver, although you do have to import this from Japan. But the silver, I think, looks really sharp, looks very similar to this Sony. This is the look that I grew up with as a kid, and I really like this look. So I almost bought one of these Denons for myself. In the end, decided to go used instead, but I definitely would consider the Denon. You know, it doesn't get quite as much love online as some of these other options in this group, but you know, online forums and things like that, they kind of have a mob mentality sometimes. As an individual person looking at it objectively, I think there's a lot to like about the Denon. Now let's say you decide to buy used instead of new. Used turntables, there's a lot more choice. You basically can pick anything from the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And in those days, pretty much every major manufacturer had multiple models on the market at any given time. So there are thousands and thousands of different turntable models to choose from. You might see them on eBay, Craigslist, your local thrift store. They're just everywhere. So what do you actually look for? Well, I've already gone through some of the different features that I like and some of the things to look for. You want a nice massive turntable. You want a well-designed tone arm with a counterweight, a decent platter. The most important thing when looking for a used turntable is condition. Almost any turntable that you buy is going to need some amount of work. Now, this is definitely one reason to consider new over used, and it's probably the main reason to consider new over used, because used turntables from the 70s and 80s or earlier will generally outperform modern turntables in terms of specifications. And in a turntable, specifications are really key. These are analog devices, they're not digital, they don't just work or not. You know, the specifications really affect the sound. And on a used turntable that's 35, 40 years old, or even older than that, there are going to be problems that may affect the sound, may affect the usability, may affect whether it even works or not. So you really have to be careful. Completeness is also a factor. My turntable, when I bought it, you know, this isn't a big deal. It didn't have these little guides. It didn't have the 45 adapter. The stylus, which is the actual needle, that was completely broken. So I don't even know if the seller knew that. A lot of sellers don't test these things really before they sell them. They turn it on, they plug it in, they turn it on. If the platter spins, they call it working. But always plan to buy a new stylus, because best case, you have no idea how many hours are on that stylus. And most likely it's going to be worn out, if not broken. Belt drive turntable, you will almost certainly need new belts. You might need some lubrication somewhere. These are some of the things to look for. It can be really tricky, and that's why a lot of people don't buy used, they buy new. It's up to you if you want to take a chance on a turntable that you might have to put some work into. It's a little bit of a learning curve. It can be fun. It can turn into a hobby. It's kind of turned into a hobby for me. I like working on audio equipment. Yeah, I'm not that great at it, but it's fun to do. Go on eBay, go on Craigslist, go to your local thrift store, see what's available. If anything looks like it's in decent shape, take a chance. You can often get a much better turntable than a modern turntable for a much lower price, even after putting the work in that you need to. Now, as a little bonus, I've brought out my old TIAC P595 turntable. This is a extremely late 90s era sort of plasticky, junky turntable. But I brought it out for a reason, and that's to show you a couple things. Now, you'll notice the tone arm looks extremely different on these two. Well, for one thing, this is a P-mount cartridge. This is a standard mount. In a new turntable, you're not going to find P-mount anymore. P-mount was an experiment that kind of went nowhere. It was intended to sort of standardize things, so you didn't have to worry about counterweights. Everything would be set up right from the start. It was a great idea, and to be honest, this turntable, despite being so light that I can pick it up with one hand, I mean, look at that. It sounded great. I have an Audio-Technica cartridge on there, aftermarket cartridge, which really sounds good. And that's another point about turntables, and that's why I generally say look for condition over anything else when you buy a used turntable, because put a decent cartridge on pretty much any turntable, it's going to sound good as long as it's weighted properly, and you have the under 3 grams tracking force and everything else is set up properly. By the way, if you do decide to look for a P-mount turntable, otherwise known as T4P, you might see them referred to that way, you can still find cartridges for those and styli. The choice is not quite as extensive as for standard mount, but there are still P-mount cartridges out there, so you don't have to worry about shying away. The only thing about it is most P-mount turntables were kind of low end to begin with, similar to this one. They were plastic, they were not great turntables. But again, you put any good cartridge on pretty much any turntable, it's going to sound really good. So don't worry that much about it. If you find one of these in good condition and it's cheap, take a chance. So that's it. As you can see, I've put the dust cover back on, which means it's time to wrap up. I hope this has helped some of you out there. Listening to records is an experience that I think everyone should be able to enjoy, and you buy the right turntable, you're going to get that much more enjoyment out of it. So happy hunting!